And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I thank you for the honor of granting me the floor to express a few views with regard to the caution we should exercise in acting on a resolution which I say borders on the fringes of misadventure if we were to act upon it in the way we are called to do so. Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned regarding the deteriorating situation in Ukraine resulting from the ongoing hostilities. As a country that suffered from a 30-year-old internal conflict, Sri Lanka affirms the truism that wars no longer end with winners or losers. Wars, as someone said, distinguished delegates, are easier to start than to stop. Look around us. How are wars won in contemporary times? Look around us. Haven't they ended indecisively? They have. Every one of them have ended indecisively. It has today become much more difficult to relate military success to political stability, which is an indispensable ingredient for peace. Mr. President, since the eruption of hostilities in Ukraine in February this year, we have seen hostile rhetoric, strategic maneuvering, and repeated closure of doors to any possible settlement of the conflict, thus relegating the humanitarian crisis and resulting suffering to the back burner. We are suicidal in our tendencies, quite frankly. We like to play with fire to our detriment. The consequences are evident to the whole world, which was already beset by the devastating effect of a pandemic and is now facing a severe energy and food crisis that has devastated economies and livelihoods around the world. Those in the developing world, like Sri Lanka, with vulnerable economies, dependent on services, mechanisms such as tourism, have been specially hard hit. All this is happening amidst multiple other challenges referred to by the Secretary General himself as a 5-alarm global fire, as he describes it. Mr. President, the vast majority of countries represented in this assembly have not invaded other countries or colonized them, nor have they engaged in proxy wars in countries far away from their own. However, we in Sri Lanka have been forced to suffer the consequences of an Easter bombing, an unknown pandemic followed by a war in the Ukraine, the cumulative effects of which have dealt our economies and countries similar to us a body blow, causing our economies to hemorrhage. That is the plight that we are in. Mr. President, Sri Lanka is of the view that the most urgent step, therefore, is to engage in talks continue to engage in talks for a ceasefire, to end the conflict and alleviate the humanitarian suffering. That is of paramount importance. The attempt to provide justification through a General Assembly resolution for seizure of sovereign assets of one party at this juncture, in our respectful view, is misconceived and misplaced and would amount to an overreach of the application of the provisions of the Charter and an engagement in what I would describe as being jurisprudential gymnastics choreographed intrinsically by a misplaced composition of misunderstood sequences, a misadventure that can go terribly wrong, my dear friends. A simple reading of the Charter provisions makes it abundantly clear that such a mechanism was never ever contemplated by the draftsman of the Charter. It can also result in setting a precedent, as observed by by the Ambassador for Eritrea. The General Assembly setting a precedent wherein the General Assembly does not have the competency to pronounce upon. What we ask are the parameters of such a mechanism. What are the outer parameters of the mechanism? Will it also apply to conflicts in other parts of the world which have been lingering for much longer? Ask yourself that question. Have these conflicts ended? Have we exhausted our best efforts to bring the conflict to an end by a pacific settlement of the disputes as envisaged by the provisions of the Charter? Distinguished delegates, think about it. Moreover, the General Assembly by its very nature is a political body for deliberation and entrusted to make political recommendations to its membership through consensus or otherwise. Distinguished delegates, the General Assembly cannot determine state responsibility or usurp the sovereign immunity of state property under international law. It cannot arrogate to itself the role of an adjudicatory tribunal. This move, therefore, creates a dangerous precedent which leaves room for any group of countries based on existing power dynamics to lay the groundwork to seize sovereign assets without any basis in international law, further aggravating the already existing mistrust and suspicion. Distinguished delegates, Mr. President, reparations by their very nature include 5 key components: cessation, assurances of non-repetition, restitution and repatriation, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. Why do countries, ask yourself the question, why do countries pay reparations? War reparations, distinguished delegates, are compensation payments made after a war by one side to the other. It is a levy on a defeated country, forcing it to pay some of the war costs of the winning country. That's what it is for. Is it the case that this war has conclusively ended? Is that the case? Isn't that far from the case? We sincerely wish it was, even indecisively. Mr. President, we are therefore of the considered view that this initiative will not only exacerbate the conflict, but might well result in compelling the parties to resort to a more lethal and sophisticated method of prosecuting the conflict that none of us would wish to see. We must take every care that we do not reach that point, the point of no return. Distinguished delegates, we must continue our efforts of diplomatic engagement at the highest level and desist from any activity or support to either party of whatever nature that would enable them to sustain military operations further. Distinguished delegates, however, sadly, there seems to be no forward movement in this regard, and steps being contemplated, such as this one, will only widen the existing fissures that would entail in a multiply effect globally, which will have to be borne by all of us, including by those member states who are not even remotely connected, I say, to this conflict, and by generations to come. Mr. President, the greatest glory, someone said, in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And it is time we got together and may put an end to this conflict by using our diplomatic means. For these reasons, Sri Lanka respectfully requests that this August Assembly does not exacerbate the conflict and engage in any activity which are not in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.